wonderful weather here in New Rochelle, and I've heard from Dr. Kruer that it's wonderful weather in Chicago as well. So we're moving into spring. And what a great way to move into spring. I can't think of a better way to move into spring, I should say, than discussing Time of Anarchy, Dr. Kruer's first book. So welcome all. As you can see, I put a link to the book and the press, Harvard University Press, in the chat. Please feel free to look at that. But I'll begin by introducing myself briefly and this author series, and then I will introduce Dr. Kruer, and then we'll move forward. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Dr. Michael Crowder. I'm the public historian at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona University. And this is a part of an ongoing series that we are so happy to have with the Thomas Paine Cottage Museum here in New Rochelle, just shortly down the road from campus, about 0.8 miles from campus, in collaboration with the New Rochelle Huguenot Historical Association. And it's yet again another of our fantastic author series. So without further ado, I'll introduce our author, and that is Dr. Matthew Kruer. He's an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, obviously in Chicago. Dr. Kruer did his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's a scholar of early modern North America, exploring compellingly, as we'll learn from his book, Time of Anarchy, the relationship between Indigenous power and the development of British Empire in North America, and I might add, in affecting other empires besides the British imperial concerns in North America as well. This book was published from Harvard University Press in 2021, and Dr. Kruer's CV is extensive, but I'll just cite a couple of things. He did win the 2016 Alan Nevins Prize for the best dissertation by an American history student. He's previously taught at the University of Oklahoma. And Dr. Kruer also, if I'm getting this correct, please correct me if I'm wrong, is a faculty liaison with the Newberry Center there at the University of Chicago, helping to create connections between American Indigenous and Canadian Indigenous communities. So without further ado, please, everybody, welcome Dr. Kruer, and we look forward to hearing you discuss your book, and then we'll do a question and answer session. So Dr. Kruer, please, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for that that very kind introduction. I'm really glad to be here tonight, and I just wanted to start out by thanking you and thanking Nora and the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies for organizing all of this. I'm really delighted to be able to come tonight and to talk to everyone about my book. So thanks to everyone in the audience as well for joining me. So let me dive right in. We'll start out in 1675. In 1675, the indigenous Susquehannock Nation became the unwitting spark for a civil war in Virginia. The previous year, in 1674, they had fled their homeland in the Susquehanna Valley, largely seeking reprieve from raids by the Haudenosaunee, more often known as the League of Five Nations Iroquois, although the Haudenosaunee is their preferred name for themselves. The Susquehannocks were allies of both Virginia and Maryland at the time, so they resettled on the Potomac River, just across the river from the spot where Mount Vernon currently sits. Unfortunately, within a few months, the Susquehannocks got caught in the crossfire during a petty dispute between Virginians and neighboring Algonquins, known as the Doigs. So I'll show you the original manuscript image here from that appears on the cover of my book. It's a contemporary sketch of this siege. Skirmishes and small raids that came out of that crossfire escalated into a siege, a full-blown siege of the Susquehannock town by English militia from Virginia and Maryland. You can see the close-up here, where you can actually see the details of the Susquehannocks' fortifications, including European-style square bastions that allowed them to sort of repel English attacks. In early 1676, though, by that time they had been expelled. They ran out of supplies and they had to leave under the cover of night in order to escape from the militia. And a few months later, in early 1676, Susquehannock warriors retaliated for this betrayal by raiding Virginia's northern frontier. Now, the leaders of Virginia, in particular, this guy on the right, Sir William Berkeley, he was considerably older than this portrait at the time, over 70, in fact. But he put the colony in a defensive position, trying to sort of get everyone ready to repel future Indigenous raids. Unfortunately, a brash young aristocrat named Nathaniel Bacon, who is in fact not the guy you see on the left. No one knows what Nathaniel Bacon looked like, but this is a memorial window that was created many, many years later and installed in a place that's now called Bacon's Castle. Nathaniel Bacon championed instead an aggressive invasion of Indian territories. The disagreement between these two positions ultimately became a political crisis and snowballed into the insurrection that historians call Bacon's Rebellion. But Bacon's Rebellion was only one of several colonial insurrections in 1676. The same year, Protestant colonists in Maryland launched an uprising against the Catholic Calvert family. The Lord Baltimore was the head of that family. And that uprising was denounced by the Calvert family as treasons and insurrections, rebellions, mutinies, and seditions. New York saw ethnic riots between English and Dutch colonists, as well as the secession of New Jersey by a group of upstart Quakers. And the following year, in Albemarle province of Northern Carolina, factional disputes among colonists escalated into a coup and then a full-blown revolution, which Governor Thomas East Church denounced as open rebellion. Now, each of these colonial conflicts was grounded very much in local politics and unfolded according to different dynamics in each location. So it's really common for scholars to think about them separately according to colonial boundaries like Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. But there is one thing that ties them all together, which is the Susquehannock Nation. After militias expelled the Susquehannocks in 1675, they scattered in every direction, splintering into at least 7 different groups. Each of those groups made their own decisions and followed independent political strategies, whether that meant seeking the protection of old allies, making peace with old enemies, or just continuing the wars that others had started. Now, although there were fewer than 500 Susquehannocks in the entire nation by 1676, nonetheless, their linkages with other Indigenous nations allowed them to exert influence wildly disproportionate to those numbers, even to the point of tipping volatile colonial societies into open revolt. In other words, what appears to be a kind of chaotic mess of different conflicts across the eastern seaboard in each of these individual colonies was actually connected by the Susquehannock people and their political initiatives as they migrated to these different places and sought survival, reconstitution, and resurgence. So my book, The Time of Anarchy, tells the story of the Susquehannocks and the ways that the power of this small nation changed the history of North America. So to start, I want to just give you, I want to talk a little bit about what I'm calling Susquehannock space. And I'm showing an image here of that is in the book that helps kind of, I think, conceptualize what Susquehannock space is. So they called their country Gandastoga, which the core of it encompassed the Susquehanna Valley in modern Pennsylvania and southern New York, the Delaware Valley, as well as the North Branch of the Potomac River. But native polities like Gandastoga didn't have the hard borders that we think of when we think of modern nation states. It's better to conceptualize them as cores of control, as you see with that kind of dark patch in the center around the lower Susquehanna Valley, with then a web of affiliations that radiate out in all directions. And that web was made up of personal connections, friendships that cross national lines, marriages that produce children belonging to both of their parents' societies, the adoption of foreigners into their communities, as well as political and economic alliances on an international scale. And part of what I want to emphasize here is that when I say Susquehannock space, there is no sharp boundary between when that space stops and when the space of other peoples begins. The spaces overlapped and are shared. So when we see this expansive map that covers everything from the Great Lakes to the Deep South as being Susquehannock space, that's not to say that Susquehannocks controlled everything about this territory. It's just to say that this is the canvas upon which we should imagine their mobility, their travels, their influence among other neighboring peoples. And because of that overlapping and shared space, because of this extensive web of connections with other people, Gandastoga was a sphere of affiliations that embraced a multitude of nations and a vast geographical space. And this social geography, I think, helps explain all of their various responses after English militia expelled them from their homes in 1675. So here's a color version of a map, and I'm going to show you several maps that appear in the book. And the purpose of these maps is to trace the travels of each of these different splinter groups and to try to track their different initiatives as they go. So I'll blow up this image, for each region as we go through them. But I just kind of want to make it clear that sort of tracery of red pathways is basically the pathways that Susquehannocks traveled as they scattered into all of these different locations. So you can see at a glance just the incredible breadth of territory that we're looking at. Okay, so as I said before, one group stayed in Virginia and raided colonial settlements, but that was a fairly small group. In fact, according to one Maryland colonist who knew the Susquehannocks really well, that entire group that precipitated crisis in Virginia was only 8 men. But 2 larger groups of people, numbering at least 100, traveled south to the Roanoke River. This was 200 miles from their town on the Potomac and more than 300 miles from their old homeland. So they deliberately traveled quite a long way. And you might wonder, what could possibly motivate them to travel so far to undertake that kind of journey in the dead of winter? Well, the answer is that it was actually familiar ground filled with familiar people. And one example, I think, gives you an indication of this. So just a few years earlier, when the German explorer John Lederer mounted an expedition in 1670, he wanted to explore beyond Virginia's frontiers to blaze new paths. And he tried to do this with local guides from Virginia, Algonquin peoples who were native to the Chesapeake area, thinking that they would have the geographic knowledge that he needed. But in fact, they didn't. They were only able to go up to the Appalachian Mountains, and then their knowledge kind of failed later. They couldn't take him any further. However, a Susquehannock guide named Jack Sedavan did possess the geographic knowledge, not only to navigate the natural terrain of the region, but also had the social connections to secure hospitality with at least 10 different indigenous nations in the sort of that greater southern region, one of which was the Occaneechees, a powerful group of traders who controlled the crossroads of the Southeastern Road Network. So I think just the fact that one Susquehannock so far away from his homeland was familiar with this place and had connections with the people of this place indicate, again, sort of that, the extent and power of that Susquehannock social space. So in 1676, Susquehannocks tried to build on those existing relations by proposing an alliance against the English with the Occaneechees. Now, unfortunately, this offer didn't appeal to the Occaneechees because their power was based on a partnership with Virginia's leading men, the wealthy planters. And that partnership was primarily an exchange of indigenous slaves that the Occaneechees provided for guns and ammunition that Virginians provided. So the Occaneechee leadership refused this Susquehannock overture, and instead they actually sent messengers to Governor Barclay with information on the Susquehannocks' location. Now, unfortunately for them, what they had intended to be a demonstration of solidarity with the English mutated in the minds of some English colonists into evidence of collusion with the Susquehannocks. Rumors started to reach frontier colonists that the Susquehannocks are joined with the Occaneechees, as Nathaniel Bacon put it, which would completely upend the balance of power in the region and cause serious danger for colonists, even more than they were already in. That rumor is what prompted Bacon to pursue the Susquehannocks south, even though that was in defiance of Barclay's direct orders. That rumor was also Bacon's motivation to betray the Occaneechees. When he arrived at the Occaneechees' town on Occaneechee Island, they offered Bacon and his men hospitality, as any ally would. But Bacon turned on them suddenly, looted their homes, enslaved several people, and burned one of their towns. Now, the Occaneechees were officially allies of Virginia, so Governor Berkeley had no choice but to declare that Bacon and his followers were rebels. And this is really the spark that gets Bacon's rebellion going. It all begins with Bacon's chase of Susquehannocks down to Occaneeche territory, and then an attack on unrelated indigenous peoples based on this suspicion that somehow Indians are all colluding together, right, as some nefarious force. But ultimately, this is all based on the Susquehannocks' gamble, right? The Susquehannocks tried to make an alliance with the Occaneechees, and it backfired. But that was responsible for transforming a war that began between Susquehannocks and Virginians into a civil war among Virginia colonists over how to respond. So Susquehannocks were also responsible for the outbreak of a related conflict in Carolina. A group of Susquehannocks moved farther south and found refuge among the Meherons and Chowanoaks of Albemarle Sound. The people who lived in, the Meherons lived in Coinchahakan, and Chowanoaks, their main town was Catacking. Both of those groups had suffered from years of Occaneeche slaving raids, and so they were willing to offer help to Susquehannocks, who were also enemies of the Occaneeches, right? However, by the end of 1676, the Meherons and Chowanoaks were at war with Carolina colonists, and the colonists placed the blame for that squarely on the Susquehannocks. North Carolina councilors stated that the Chowanoaks had been peaceful allies until, as they put it, by incitements of the rebellious Indians of Virginia who fled to them, they committed hostility upon the inhabitants of this government. Other Carolinians claimed that some of the Meherons were formerly called Susquehannocks, which suggests that this is referring, the rebellious Indians of Virginia is referring to the migrating Susquehannocks. So in other words, it's the Susquehannocks who had suffered at the hands of English militia on the Potomac who continued to wage that conflict down in Albemarle. And that conflict was the backdrop for a small-scale revolution known as Culpeper's Rebellion. The government of Albemarle was at that point in the hands of fiercely independent settlers who resented the colony's official rulers. Those rulers were a clique of 8 favored courtiers in King Charles's court, who personally owned the entire colony and were known as the Lords Proprietors. But the settlers' government was unable to effectively oppose the Susquehannocks and their allies, and it buckled under the strain of trying to do so. One agent of the Lords Proprietors named Thomas Miller took control of the government on a very Bacon-like platform of destroying all indigenous peoples to end this threat. However, anti-proprietary colonists who were led by John Culpeper and George Durant sailed to England, claiming that they were there to supply the country with arms and ammunition for their defense against the heathen. But by 1677, the influx of weapons allowed deeply divided colonists to turn their guns on each other. A revolutionary regime opposed to the Lords Proprietors took control of Albemarle and ran it well into the 1680s. Okay, so that's the Southern theater that we can think about. There's another Susquehannock group whose story is very, very different. They used their kinship connections in the Delaware Valley to evade the colonial gaze and avoid conflict as much as they could. So if we shift our attention a little bit north, we can see this Delaware Valley area, which was a place that Susquehannocks had friends and family among the Lenapes and Munsees who were indigenous to that region. And since the 1630s, all of these peoples had been firm allies in a trade partnership that had linked Gandastoga in the Susquehanna Valley to coastal outposts of Swedish, Dutch, and English colonists. Now, over time, as the bonds of alliance matured, there were multi-ethnic leaders of Susquehannock descent who emerged among these Lenapes and Munsees. So just one example is a Munsee leader of the Hackensack Band, whose name was Minquasachemak. He was one of the original proprietors of what's now called Staten Island. And Minquasachemak literally advertised his Susquehannock heritage as part of his identity. His name translates into Susquehannock chief. So I think leaders like Minquasachemak were the people who offered refuge to their Susquehannock kinfolk during this time of need. So these Susquehannocks maintained a wary distance from colonists as much as they could, but their presence in the Delaware Valley caused destabilizing rumors to ripple through colonial communities. the specter of Anglo-Indigenous violence, even without any particular cause, was enough to heighten antagonism between English and Dutch colonists, which was already quite bitter. The English had conquered the Dutch in 1664, which turned New Netherland into New York. And then the Dutch had conquered it back in 1673, before a peace treaty in 1674 returned it to English control. And these repeated military struggles and regime changes did not really promote ethnic harmony between English and Dutch settlers. There was a lot of bitter feelings over this. And so when news of fighting between settlers and natives percolated through the region in 1676, Dutch colonists in New York City, who were not fans of the English regime, started to spread rumors that the Netherlands was mobilizing a fleet to reconquer Manhattan yet again. Other Dutch colonists in Albany dressed up as Indian fighting frontiersmen, and they threatened, as they put it, to drive away and kill the Indians on the river, which was an alarming parallel to exactly what Bacon's followers in Virginia were doing. A little bit further south in Delaware, around Newcastle, rumors about a murdered family, which later proved entirely false. Nonetheless, those rumors caused Deputy Governor Edmund Cantwell to sound the alarm, which in the 17th century, sounding the alarm meant firing cannons into the air so that everybody, could hear that there was an alarm. And as you might imagine, mobilizing the militia on the one hand was, one effect of that, but it also just spread panic throughout the entire region that Susquehannock attacks were imminent and that all of them were vulnerable. So New York's governor, who was a professional soldier named Edmund Andros, tried to step in and stabilize this situation. But his attempts at diplomacy really foundered on the Susquehannocks' determination to avoid colonial entanglements. Andros convinced the Susquehannocks to meet for talks in June 1676 after a lot of effort. And he proposed to the Susquehannocks that he would broker peace on their behalf, both with the Haudenosaunee enemies that they were still fighting with, as well as the Southern colonies who had expelled them from their home on the Potomac. But the Susquehannock spokesman, whose name was Canachowido, rebuffed this overture, and the Susquehannocks never returned to New York. So Andros assumed that the Susquehannocks were desperate and that they would leap at the chance to get colonial protection, even if it meant some kind of subservience or submission to the colonial government. But the Susquehannocks didn't see themselves in such dire straits. I think this is a reminder that just because Indigenous peoples are small or scattered doesn't mean that they're weak. And if we remember the social and political geography of Candistoga, we can better understand what Canachowido was thinking. So the Susquehannocks shared a common origin with the Haudenosaunee, dating back to the 15th century, right? Long before the 17th century wars began, they had started out as very similar neighboring peoples, or even really having common ancestors. And they kept that memory, the memory of that shared ancestry, alive through rituals that celebrated their historic connection. So, for example, Susquehannocks made regular pilgrimages to a cemetery at Tioga Point in what's currently northern Pennsylvania. And the ceremony that they performed involved unearthing long dead ancestors that they shared with the Haudenosaunee, and then reburying those ancestors with newly deceased Susquehannocks. In most cases, they would arrange the bodies of the ancestor and the recently deceased Susquehannock in an embrace, so that the ancestor was kind of cradling the newly deceased person in a symbol of the intimacy that bound their peoples together over time. Now, the violence of 17th century mourning wars paradoxically strengthened these ties rather than weaken them. Now, when I say mourning war is what scholars call an Iroquoian practice of warfare that was not aimed at killing enemies or capturing territory. It was aimed at capturing enemies. It was more concerned with people, right? And it was based fundamentally on the way that Iroquoians, such as Susquehannocks and Haudenosaunee, processed the death of loved ones. They believed that grief was an inherently destructive emotion and that it would ultimately cause insanity to the individual and cause real harm to the entire community if it was not healed properly. So that grief might be healed through ceremonies that allowed the bereaved to recover, but sometimes those ceremonies didn't work for whatever reason. And the elder women of a bereaved family could then call for a mourning war, essentially asking warriors from the community to go out, capture enemies, and then bring them back. Then, depending on what the elder women decided, those captives would meet one of two fates. One, they might be tortured and executed by the whole community as a way of collectively expelling grief. And that could be one way for them to heal. The second thing that might happen, and this was quite common in the 17th century, was that the captives would be adopted. They would literally replace lost, deceased family members and take on a new identity in the community and therefore make the community whole again. So that was one of the goals of mourning war. So it's that practice of adoption that I think is really important here, because adoption strengthened ties between Susquehannocks and Haudenosaunee, even during the times when they were actively at war with each other. In 1668, a Jesuit observer estimated that what he described as Susquehannock prisoners of war made up as much as 1/3 of the Cayuga Nation's population. Susquehannocks could be found in significant numbers at the Christian communities of La Prairie and among the Senecas of La Concepcion in the St. Lawrence Valley. In 1674 alone, at least 30 Susquehannocks were captured and adopted into the Onondaga Nation. In other words, even as the Susquehannock population in Gandastoga declined over time, the Susquehannock population in Iroquois among the Haudenosaunee grew and effectively created a kind of shadow nation of people who identified as both Haudenosaunee and Susquehannock, right? They didn't just change their identity, they gained a new one in the process. In 1675, Mohawks informed the Susquehannocks that they were ready to end the fighting and finally heal the rift between their nations. The Mohawks said that they considered the Susquehannocks their offspring and wished to concorporate again with their brothers and children. So in short, all of this is to say that in 1676, Susquehannocks didn't want or need interference from Governor Andros or any other colonists. Thanks to the relationships with Haudenosaunee as well as Lenapes and Munsees, they were confident that they could still determine their own destinies, even though they were a small and scattered nation. And so did another group that returned to their old homeland and rebuilt their old capital town at Gandastoga's center. Although unlike the Susquehannocks in Delaware, this group decided to continue warring against their enemies, not colonists, but indigenous enemies. So they relied on a broker who went by the slick nickname, Jacob, my friend. There was only one Jacob who was everybody's friend, and he actually shows up in documents as Jacob, my friend, all the time. Jacob, my friend, was a Dutch fur trader who had married a Susquehannock woman and fathered several Susquehannock children and lived in Gandastoga for much of the 1650s. And he helped negotiate a ceasefire between English colonists in Maryland and the Susquehannock Nation, or this particular group of Susquehannocks. But the tributary Conoy nations, the indigenous nations of Maryland, were another story. The Conoys were tributaries of Maryland, which meant that they had signed treaties recognizing themselves as subjects of the King of England, and they accepted the authority of Maryland's government. And because of that, Conoy fighters had participated in the 1675 siege of the Susquehannock town, and in the months afterward had killed or captured several dozen Susquehannocks as they were trying to escape. So this group of Susquehannocks who were back in the Susquehanna Valley intended to turn the tide of that ongoing battle by bringing the fight to the Conoys communities. And they were very successful. By the middle of 1676, the headman Maquata told the Maryland government that he was in great danger of being destroyed by the Susquehannocks and therefore feared for his own life. Lord Baltimore and his inner circle of Catholic officials was obligated by treaty to assist the Conoys, so the government sent arms, ammunition, and soldiers to aid in their defense. But that enraged most colonists, who, first of all, were Protestant. And Protestants had longstanding grievances against the government, in large part because they associated Catholicism with tyranny and thought of the Baltimore regime as being kind of inherently illegitimate. But they were also inundated at the same time by news of carnage in Virginia and rumors floating all over the place to the north. And they worried that the Conoys would turn on them if given a chance, especially if given a chance while heavily armed with new supplies of guns and ammunition. And in fact, just as an aside, Protestant colonists in Maryland were absolutely conspiratorial about all of this. I want to show you an anonymous manifesto that came out in 1676. And I just want to show you this because this is one of the most excruciating documents that I came across in my research. You can see the tiny, tiny crabbed little writing. If you actually read it, like many manifestos, as you might imagine, it is bananas. If you zoom in on just one part of it, this anonymous manifesto accuses the Catholic Lord Baltimore of colluding with Susquehannocks and other indigenous nations to oppress and slaughter Protestant colonists. It begins by denouncing Baltimore and the Baltimorean party, and it thunders, "Pope Jesuit is determined to overturn England with fire and sword and distractions, and the Maryland Papists will drive us Protestants to purgatory in America with the help of the French spirits from Canada." And of course, all of that began with the betrayal of the people by allowing the Susquehannocks to attack, which the Baltimore regime deliberately allowed so that Protestants could be cut off and massacred. It goes on like this for 12 pages. But you can see, I think, this is just one of many, many different conspiracy theories that were floating around, driving the breakdown of order and political instability during this time, because colonists started to see multiple different kinds of political cleavages as being all part of the same enemy. And that ultimately led to sort of fatal breakdowns in these fragile colonial regimes. So in Maryland, as a result of this, the same pattern of Bacon's Rebellion played out in miniature. There was a small but very vocal faction which demanded that the government brand all Native peoples enemies of the state. And then when the government refused to do that, moved to overthrow them in an armed rebellion. The Baltimore government, unlike in Virginia, the Baltimore government was able to crush this budding rebellion in Maryland, partially because they took decisive action as early as possible to avoid Virginia's fate. But Susquehannock raids didn't stop, and that continued instability on the frontier kept popular resentment of the government at a low boil for years, and colonists' fears of indigenous peoples were constantly being raised by all kinds of different alarms. So given the pattern that is emerging here, I think the actions of Susquehannocks in Virginia should take on a new meaning, right? It's part of this larger pattern that's happening in many different places. Tributary indigenous nations in Virginia who were under suspicion from frightened colonists, those tributary nations offered their military services to the Virginia government against the Susquehannocks, right, hoping to prove their loyalty. But one of the things that did was make Virginia natives enemies of the Susquehannocks, so that fighting is coming all over the Virginia frontier. And that kept Virginia's frontiers in turmoil, right? That meant colonist anger at the government for years, and of course, colonists' fear of indigenous peoples for years. Long after Bacon's Rebellion was officially crushed in early 1677. And this was only one of many ripple effects of Susquehannock actions, the ramifications of which you can see all the way from the Great Lakes to the Deep South. So all of this instability, all of this disorder was supposed to be settled by two landmark peace treaties in 1677. The first treaty was a native council that took place at Shakamaxon in what's currently Philadelphia, more or less. And at Shakamaxon, Susquehannock envoys crafted a détente with the Haudenosaunee. They finally made peace. And as a result of that, about 100 Susquehannocks joined the Haudenosaunee. The remainder of them stayed in the Delaware Valley among Lenape-kin. There was a second treaty that took place at Albany, which forged the beginnings of an alliance between the Haudenosaunee and English colonies that later became known as the Covenant Chain. This treaty effectively ratified the decisions that had already been made at Shackamaxon and just made colonists a party to those decisions. The two treaties were supposed to bring an end to the wars between Susquehannocks and settlers, right? But unfortunately, it did not. As far as the English were concerned, the treaties of 1677 had dissolved the Susquehannock nation and just made them a part of the Haudenosaunee, right? They were supposed to disappear into the population of Iroquois, but that's not what happened at all. Rather than disappearing into the Haudenosaunee population, Susquehannocks instead, as I said before, layered on a new identity on top of their old ones. They became part of Haudenosaunee communities, but they remained Susquehannock in very meaningful ways. And that's what dictated their behavior going forward. So a Seneca Nation ambassador, one of the Haudenosaunee nations, tried to explain this to colonists in 1679. And this you see, this is a colonial rendering of a map that this Seneca ambassador drew to try to explain what had happened to the Susquehannock people in Iroquois. And what he essentially said was that the Susquehannocks lived peacefully in Iroquois, but not only that, they had actually become influential leaders in their communities. He claimed that Haudenosaunee had initially been peaceful toward English and Algonquin indigenous nations in the Chesapeake. But as he put it, by the insinuation and instigation of the Susquehannocks, they are now all become one in their hostility. Susquehannock war captains very soon led Haudenosaunee raiders on expeditions against indigenous nations who had wronged them in 1675 and 1676, especially the Occaneechees and tributary indigenous nations in the Chesapeake. So although the Susquehannocks were scattered, even now they were still in at least two different locations, and many had still remained in Albemarle. Even though they were still scattered, they were actually stronger than ever, and their influence drove politics on a regional scale. By 1683, many of the indigenous nations who had sided with English colonists against the Susquehannocks had been dispersed or destroyed or were battling desperately for survival. Periodic panics among the vulnerable colonists helped to spark a second uprising in Maryland in 1681 and a second uprising in Virginia in 1682. Colonial governments had no choice but to go back to the bargaining table at Albany again and again, trying to get some kind of lasting peace arrangement. But ultimately, their efforts came to nothing, and the fighting only stopped because Susquehannocks decided to stay home. As one leader in Iroquois reportedly declared, he was pretty well satisfied with the revenge he had taken. And so by 1685, he was ready to stop. Now, although the wars and upheavals caused by Susquehannock influence did come to an end by 1685, by that point, Eastern North America had been transformed. One of the major takeaway points of my book is that the time of Anarchy's legacy was a revolution in Anglo-Indigenous affairs. The Covenant Chain Alliance between the English colonies and the Haudenosaunee structured Anglo-Indigenous relations across the Northeast for most of the next century. The Susquehannocks' decimation of Occaneeche power, combined with the end of the Virginia planters' monopoly on the Indian trade, resulted in a dramatic expansion of slaving networks deep into the Southeast. Bacon's treatment of every Indian as an enemy inspired new forms of racial thinking among colonists that increasingly pushed coastal natives to precarious margins of society. But also, indigenous leaders who had upheld their treaty obligations they effectively parlayed their loyalty into new treaties that marshaled imperial power to protect their people and carve out crucial space for a viable indigenous future. All of these far-reaching legacies were the result, sometimes directly, often indirectly, but nonetheless, the result of Susquehannock initiatives. As for the Susquehannocks, with many of their enemies defeated and peace restored, Susquehannocks started moving back into their old homeland. At first, it was just a few migrants from Haudenosaunee country, with others joining them from Delaware and Ohio and the South. Congregating in the lower Susquehanna Valley, they built a new town that colonists called Conestoga, basically just an anglicization of what they called their own town, Candistoga. Conestoga prospered for half a century as allies of the Haudenosaunee and New York and Pennsylvania after that province was founded in 1682. So I want to show you just one final image, which is a comb that was crafted by a Conestoga man, a Conestoga artisan, and would have been worn by an elite woman in her hair on ceremonial occasions or diplomatic occasions. And it shows a Susquehannock on the left and a Pennsylvania Quaker on the right, extending their hands in peace. I think it's the perfect encapsulation of the hopes and ambitions of the Susquehannocks as they decided to end their wars and to start over. As Candistoga became Conestoga, there was a new generation of Susquehannocks that found a place at the crossroads of a thriving intercultural economy, and even after everything that they had been through, found a way to be hopeful about the future. So I will stop there, and I'm really happy to answer any questions that anyone in the audience has. Oh, Michael, I think you might be muted.
Excuse me, I am back here. I have a million questions, and I know that there are questions already popping up amongst the attendees. And I think you answered one already about the question that Judith asked about the differences between Maryland Protestants and Maryland Catholics. But before we dive into that, Judith, and I do think that's an interesting question to ask. Do you mind, Matthew, if I asked you just a quick question? It's something that didn't come up too much, but it's a theme in chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6 of your book, which is conspiracy theory, and how conspiracy theory sort of informed these relationships. And the great thing about your book is that you show us that the power dynamics between European colonists and Indigenous Americans are much more complex, as you just explained. So I won't do that. But could you tell us a little bit more about conspiracy theory and how that informed people's thinking in the moment?
Absolutely. Conspiracy theory is a really important part of understanding how the ripple effects that I mentioned could ramify so far. It was often because colonists were their own worst enemies, because they wound up engaging in these kinds of social and political processes that magnified their own kind of political cleavages in ways that ultimately were extremely destructive. So one of those that's really crucial is just an English cultural tradition that scholars often call anti-popery, right? As in like anti the Pope. And this has a sort of a long and complicated genealogy, but the short version is that, you know, the English had undergone a distinctive form of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, starting with Henry VIII, but had gone back and forth between, you know, Protestant Henry VIII, Catholic Mary I, right? And there was a lot of political upheaval that came as a result of this Reformation before it ultimately solidified itself as a nation that was kind of inherently Protestant. So because English people thought of themselves as kind of inherently Protestant, Catholics were like the ultimate other. You might kind of think of it as the way that a lot of Americans thought about communists in the 20th century. Like, it's just un-American, you know, Catholics were un-English in every conceivable way. And so there was a lot of suspicion of Catholics. There was a lot of prejudice against Catholics. There was a lot of concern that Catholics were just fundamentally incompatible with the idea of, with English values like English liberty. So it was very complicated for there to be a colony that was a colony like Maryland, whose leader was not just leader, but actually the kind of the proprietor, the owner of that colony by charter, was a Catholic. And a lot of his inner circle, who held a lot of power within the colony, were also Catholic, even though most of the colonists themselves by the 1670s were Protestants. So there was an enormous amount of distrust and an enormous amount of suspicion of all kinds of different government initiatives, even ones that seemed like they were fairly straightforward ideas. it really made it complicated for the Maryland government to do anything productive, because one of the things that happened right away is that when fighting broke out between Maryland and the Susquehannocks, it was an accident, right? Maryland did not intend for that to happen, and so they tried to make peace initiatives to sort of solve the issue before it spiraled out of control. And so they tried to open diplomatic negotiations, which you might think is a very sensible thing to do. But from the perspective of a lot of Protestant colonists, that folded into this kind of conspiratorial mindset that, oh my, what if Lord Baltimore is conspiring with the enemy? Like, what if he's hiring these indigenous people to come and kill us in our sleep? Like, those are the kind of conversations that start happening. And I think when you have a very small face-to-face society where people are talking about this every day as they're working in the fields, they talk about it at church, they talk about it when they're playing games, they talk about it when they're drinking at the tavern, these stories just really quickly spiral out of control. And they wind up driving a lot of the political conflict that you see during this time period.
Fantastic, thank you. And Barbara, I'm Barbara Crane. I'm going to ask you to ask your question in a second, but before I do that, I have to be selfish and ask one more question, Matthew. Dr. Kruer, excuse me. So I'm curious about some of the individuals that you discussed. Jacob Young, which is his anglicized name, Jacob, my friend, which is how he's referred to throughout the book, but originally Dutch or from the Netherlands. Also, and please correct me if I mispronounce this, but Kakakuska. I'm sorry, did I pronounce that correctly?
It's pretty close. It's Coca-Cola.
Okay. A woman who was the paramount chief of, and who had a significant amount of influence. So can I ask you just to talk about a little bit more about Jacob, my friend, and Kakakuska, if I again pronounce that correctly, as two individuals who were very connected, but also different in our minds, I think.
Yeah. I'm sorry that individuals kind of fell out of this broad brush treatment.
And that's why your book's so awesome, because we're introduced to these people who are just not the kind of people that we'd be introduced to. Typically,
these are two of my favorite people in the book. So I'm really glad you asked about them. So you're right. Jacob, my friend, was born Jacob Claassen in the Netherlands and immigrated to North America when under the auspices of the Dutch West India Company when New Netherland was a colony. And he was primarily based in a small outpost called Fort Nassau in what's now the kind of like the area around Wilmington, Delaware. Mm-hmm. And this was just a kind of a relatively small outpost that was dedicated toward the trade with Susquehannocks. And so he developed, he was one of a relatively small crew of Europeans that developed really close relationships with Susquehannocks. As I said, including, he spent time in the 1650s living in Candastoga. There are multiple records that point to his marriage to a Susquehannock woman and children that he had with her, although there's not any records about what happened to any of them. So that's unfortunately not something that we can know. But he had a really interesting history, because he was one of those people who saw that New Netherland was a sinking ship at a certain point in the 1660s, that it was going to be taken over by the sort of more dynamic, more aggressive English rivals of the region. And so he just crossed the river and moved into Maryland. And in Maryland, he went from Jacob Claassen to Jacob Young, took on a new name, and he became naturalized as an English subject and a resident of Maryland. And part of the reason he could do that was because he was useful, because Maryland also wanted to have this trade with the Susquehannocks, and he had a really close relationship with them that he could, serve as the conduit for an alliance between Maryland and the Susquehannock nation. So he was really instrumental in all kinds of diplomatic negotiations. He carried messages. He actually was a really important arms dealer. I'm not sure what term you would use, but he was responsible for getting a lot of shipments of goods, including weapons and ammunition, from Maryland to the Susquehannock town in order to help them defend themselves against Haudenosaunee raiders. So he was incredibly important to maintaining this whole alliance for a long period of time. And ultimately, that was kind of his undoing in a way, because his closeness with the Susquehannocks during this time period, during this 10-year time of anarchy in the 1670s and 1680s, caused his own, caused the leaders of Maryland to distrust him and to believe that he was more attached, more loyal to the Susquehannocks, to his family, than he was to the province of Maryland. And they ultimately put him on trial for treason and convicted him. There's a really interesting moment, actually, where when the Susquehannock Nation is supposedly gone, when Maryland is actually going around telling its neighbors, telling William Penn, for example, that the Susquehannock Nation is destroyed and all of the old Susquehannock territory belongs to Maryland now by right of conquest. At that exact same moment, they cancel Jacob's trial for treason because they receive a threat from Susquehannocks, who essentially say, Jacob is our friend, he's one of us. If you hurt him, then we will retaliate. So in Maryland, they're like, oh, we can't do that. So they call everything off and to avoid angering the Susquehannocks. And eventually Jacob, again, kind of jumps ship. He gets exiled from Maryland and moves into Pennsylvania, and is really instrumental in setting up the economic relationships between the new Pennsylvania government and indigenous peoples of the Susquehanna Valley, including the Conestoga. So his story is kind of braided throughout this entire time period. The other person you mentioned is Coco Koweski, who is the—
Thank you for correcting me, by the way.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, she was the Werowansqua, or the female chief is the English translation that we usually use. But the Werowansqua of the Pamunkey Nation. The Pamunkey Nation is one of the tributary nations of within Virginia. It's also kind of, probably most famous for being the nation that was at the center of the Powhatan paramount chiefdom in the early 1600s. Powhatan himself, who met John Smith and all of that, his successor, Opechancanough, they were all Pamunkeys. So Pamunkey was kind of like, it was the largest and most powerful of the indigenous nations in the Chesapeake, and it remained so even after the chiefdom was more or less pulled apart in 1646 by the English after the Third Anglo-Powhatan War. And she was extraordinary. She was very savvy when it came to navigating English culture, especially English political culture. She spoke English, although she didn't necessarily actually speak it. She often refused to speak it in diplomatic circumstances and worked through a translator, even though she could understand English and speak it. But just to prove a point about who she was and what her status was, she sometimes refused to. She cultivated relationships with a number of powerful English men. One of them was John West, who was sort of one of the most powerful and important colonists on the north, the northern frontier of the colony. West Point is named for him. And she had a it's not clear how long their relationship lasted, but they did have an intimate relationship, and she had a son with John West, who was named John West. Although he lived among the Pamunkey, he was, for all intents and purposes, he was Pamunkey, not English, even though he had an English name. She was also very good friends with a guy who served as governor for a while named Francis Morrison, and corresponded with him actually when he returned to England. And managed to get him to be a big champion of Indigenous peoples in general, but more specifically of the Pamunkey and of her specifically. There's all kinds of documents about from this guy, Francis Morrison, when he's in London and he's essentially trying to help the English government figure out how to respond to Bacon's rebellion, this, this colonial situation. And Francis Morrison repeatedly is like, okay, yes, this is important. I have all these ideas, but Kokokoeski, we need to come to her aid, and the Pamunkey are really important. Everything depends on them. And so she has the relationship that she cultivates with him means that he is her champion, and he remains so after he comes back to Virginia and still has a position of power there. And so as a result of all of this, as a result of her knowledge and her savvy and her cultivation of these kinds of relationships, even though the Pamunkeys are targeted by Bacon and his followers, they have a really, really rough time during the rebellion, because one of Bacon's major goals is to, he proclaims it quite openly, one of his goals is to exterminate Indigenous peoples. And so he chases Kokokoeski and Pamunkeys and all of the other nations of Virginia whenever he can, and he kills them and enslaves them and plunders whatever he can find. So it's a very, very difficult time, and Kokokoeski has to use all of her, she has to marshal all of her resources to survive and to make her people survive. And so that's, I think, one of the really extraordinary things is that what comes out of this in 1677, she negotiates, and actually I think scholars argue that she doesn't just negotiate, she actually kind of helps design a treaty between the Indigenous peoples of Virginia, with her at the top, and the King of England. This is the first treaty that's imperial rather than colonial. It's not with Virginia, it's actually with the king. And that treaty not only guarantees a whole bunch of protections to Pamunkeys and other native peoples, things like access to the legal system, protections of their property, the rights to gather traditional foods, access to waterways, for example. There's all kinds of things that are built into that. Protection from enslavement, which is a really huge one. She designs a lot of these things that are essential to her people's survival and gets them into that treaty. Right. But she also gets the treaty to reconstitute the Powhatan paramountcy. Essentially what it does is it takes the status quo of having all of these different individual native nations in Virginia, which are all subject to the governor of Virginia. And instead it says all of these nations are, first, they're subject to Kokokoeski, the queen of Pamunkey. And then she is subject to the King of England. So it creates a kind of a new hierarchical political structure that, the imperial officials think is going to be a better framework for orderly governance. And but Kokokoeski is also very happy with too, because it's literally recreating the thing that colonists had destroyed generations before. And I think that's it's a testament to how creative and how resilient and how resourceful these native leaders were, even in the midst of this in really trying crisis.
Yeah, thank you. And one of the themes in the earlier part of the book, and everybody should buy the book, is this theme of patriarchy, which suffuses. I'll start with 16th century, but 17th century, 18th century, English / British / Western European colonialism. And that's why Kokokoeski, if I said that correctly, is such a fascinating figure, because she's a woman who is working in these worlds as a diplomat, as a leader, as somebody who defied, almost by definition, the kind of leader that a colonial governor of Virginia, for example, not Berkeley, would have thought to be a leader. And I'll turn it over to the audience questions. And Barbara, I see that you have your hand up, and I'll start by asking one part with Barbara what I think your question is, and then and perhaps Barbara, you can expound upon this. But this idea, it's the title of your book, The Time of Anarchy. What is it about this time period? What is it about let's say the mid 1760s until the middle of the hold on, excuse me, 1660s until the middle of the 1670s. I do study Thomas Paine, excuse me, so I have 1760s, 1770s in my head all the time. But what is it about this time period that makes it such a, why did the world change in this time period? And you discussed this, and of course, in some of, in much of what you discussed earlier on, but like, what is it about this, in particular, this 1765, 1766, 1675, 1676,
I got you.
1677. I'm sorry, I will always get that wrong. What is it about that time period that really changes the trajectory of history in North America?
Yeah. Well, so the very short answer to that is, to kind of to go back to the point that I more or less closed with about the revolution in Anglo-Indigenous.
Yeah.
That sort of the real takeaway from all of this is that out of this incredible instability and destructive period, this destructive period comes a series of new structures that continue well into the 18th century that really kind of shape not just the kind of the mid-Atlantic where the Susquehannocks are native to, but the entire Northeast, the Great Lakes, the Deep South. All of these regions are shaped by the structures that come out of the time of anarchy, especially the new ideas about race that Bacon and other colonists start to come up with. They start thinking about Indigenous peoples not as individual nations, but as just like Indians, and all Indians are alike, and all Indians are dangerous. Those kinds of ideas have a long afterlife. They continue to develop, and this is a really important moment that kind of sets that process going. That's one. Another one is that Covenant Chain Alliance. The Covenant Chain Alliance has had a lot of study from historians because I think it's recognized as being really, really crucial to the entire course of British colonialism. What happens in the 18th century is that British colonies and the Haudenosaunee nations kind of cooperate. They cooperate through the means of this Covenant Chain Alliance to mutually expand their powers over new territories and new peoples. And that's really, that shapes everything that happens as the British Empire expands and then eventually comes into conflict with the French Empire and the 7 Years' War. And that's when we finally get to the 1760s. So that's another one. There's another structure that comes about, which is it's a structure of violence. It's actually a structure of disorder, but I think it's an important thing to understand as the result of all this, which is the kind of the opening of the floodgates of the indigenous slave trade. Colonists had been enslaving indigenous peoples for pretty much since they arrived, but it was pretty small scale and it was opportunistic, and there were all sorts of limitations on it. But after this moment, after Bacon and other colonists decide that Native people have to be exterminated, after they create legal structures that allow for unlimited exploitation, the enslavement of any kind of war captive, for example, none of this remains constant, but it does mean that after that time period, after 1677, 78, 79, you just see a massive expansion of the amount of slaving that is occurring throughout the entire region. In Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina, all sorts of Native groups, all the way to the Mississippi Valley, get sucked into this maw. It's incredibly destructive, and it completely reshapes that entire region as well. That's a third one. And then the fourth one is a fourth aspect of that revolution in Anglo-Indigenous affairs is the creation of those new treaty structures, the kind of treaty that Coca-Coesky was able to design and negotiate and enact, because that creates a new way for Indigenous peoples to be an official part of the English and later British Empire. And, not to say that story ends well. There's a lot of violence that comes out of that settler colonial development over time. But given the fact that that essentially genocide was a real possibility in 1676. The fact that what happens instead, thanks to Kokokoeski and similar kinds of leaders, what happens instead is a new treaty structure that guarantees Native people a place, a future. That's a really important legacy of this too. So that's kind of, I think in terms of why this is important, why it changes history. Those are I think the four takeaways that I would offer.
So we have 2 minutes left, but can I just follow up? So it sounds like you've maybe talked about the work that you're looking to do moving forward. Maybe about the Native American slave trade, maybe about the 19th century as you move forward in time. Like, what are you thinking about doing moving forward?
You mean like for a next project?
Next book? What's your next book going to be?
My
I
next
know we're here to talk about your first book, but
yeah. I appreciate that. My next book is about sovereignty. I'm really interested in exploring what sovereignty meant for Native people in the 17th century and in the 18th century, and how colonists understood Indigenous sovereignty. And really the kind of the ways that those ideas, those sets of ideas intersected and shaped each other. I think one of my working hypotheses is that the ways that Native people insisted on their sovereignty being understood by colonists actually affected the way that colonists thought about sovereignty in their own world.
Right.
And when those questions become really, really contentious, like for example, when there's disagreement between colonists and imperial policymakers about parliamentary supremacy or whatever, when they have to ask themselves, okay, what does it actually mean to be a member of this empire? Where is authority located? How does this work? I think that's not just an Anglo-American story. I think actually there's a much richer history about how sovereignty developed, how it intellectually developed, how it culturally developed, how it practically developed, just in terms of practices on the ground. And I want to look at that across the British Empire.
Amazing. So, well, first of all, we're going to read your first book, and we're going to read your second book. Thank you so much, Dr. Kruer, for joining us all the way from Chicago, where the weather is beautiful, and it's, I think, still beautiful here in the New York City area. Thank you so much, Dr. Kruer. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we hope you all have a wonderful Friday evening and then a wonderful weekend.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, everyone, for coming.